Hello, it's RC Bits. Welcome to part one of the actual build of the Axial XR10. You see laid out here, I've just got together all the bits that we need to do steps 1 through to 5, which really is opening bag A. And you see there's a couple of plastic parts trees that we'll need. And I've just got my tools out, you know, the grease and the Loctite that we're going to need. The motor actually comes into play on part 5, so I've obviously got that ready. Just familiarise yourself with the manual, look through, have a look at the pictures, see what steps you're going to do, how far you think you might get, just so that you can have an idea of what's coming up and that the parts then look familiar when you start to assemble them. Do note in the margins it shows you the components that you're going to use, and they're also to scale, so if you're ever unsure, if you've got a couple of screws that look a similar size, you can just lay them on the instructions and that's going to tell you which ones they are. Always get out all your bits for each stage. So for this you want to get out all the components, the bearings, the motor plate and the shaft. Lay them out as they are in the picture and just take note of the directions that everything goes together. It's very important, especially in this build because there are a few screws that can go either way round. On the Axial manual you can see that they've noted optional parts like titanium shafts and the new machined gears. Shows you different pinions that you can get that are steel rather than the ones that are supplied with the kit. And also there is a recommendation not to use motors 12 to 35 turn, but to use a 45 to 55 turn. So I'm using, well, the extreme of that, I'm using 55 turn for my particular build. So with everything laid out, as in steps 1 and 2, we need to install a small pin in the shaft, and the gear goes behind, and you'll see the pin just drops in to the back. Then got a small C-clip that just captures that gear in place. So just rest it in the groove where it's going to go, and you can just pinch that on with some pliers. That should then be firm on the shaft. Now with the motor plate, it's worth noting that people are removing a small section out of here so when the half shafts are in, you can actually take the motor out without having to disassemble the whole of the axle. I'm going to leave it in for this particular build. I've got the bearings here ready. Just put a drop of the 30 weight oil on there just to help prolong their life. If you've been looking at XR10s, you'll know that there's a lot of upgrades for this particular part, and people have put bigger bearings in, and there is a new motor plate that can be done. Now the easiest way to do this, put the shaft through the hole and then slide the bearing down into its seat, and the second flange bearing in the next hole along. So for step 2 we need this plastic part which has got part of the servo mount on, and we need to just drop a bearing into a groove on the back. Now it doesn't say about greasing the drive gear, however this is quite a good time to do it. So just open up your grease, pop a little bit all the way around, you can now push that through, it should drop in the bearing. And then there's just one screw which is going to hold all that in place. 2mm hex. Don't over tighten it because obviously you're just going into plastic. It's very easy to strip it out. On this idle gear you'll see there's a small arrow on one side and not on the other. So just take note on the manual that arrow needs to be facing towards us when we're building. So as before, small pin, idle gear then with the arrow facing outwards, that should lock in place. And that's then, as before, retained with a C-clip. Just pop that on the groove. Just pinch it down. Now we can add our final flanged washer and the transfer gear and the stepped gear. There's then a small pin to go in the transfer gear shaft, and the final idle gear goes on, making sure that the little triangle's away from you and that the pin is sat right in the back. So now the last 3 ordinary bearings go into this plastic case. The final 2 bearings are quite tricky. I always find is just try and get them to go into the groove as squarely as you can, and then they should just gently push down into where the seats are. And when you're nearly home, just go across the 2 faces of them, the driver, and then just push. Before we get the cover on, we need to just add some grease to these gears. This way, let's just apply a little bit between the joins, and then just run the gear around. You want a good covering. Now that the gears are greased, we can pop this cover over the top. It should sit home over the motor plate. Make sure, just remember to pop the locking nut inside that little hole. The front cover with the bearings that we installed earlier then goes on the front. Should sit snugly all the way around, and the smaller of the screws goes in the top left hand side, and the longer one goes in the right, and that goes into the motor plate. You may just want to pop a little bit of blue Loctite on that particular screw to stop it backing out. This one's fine because we're just cutting into the plastic. So in step 5, first thing to do is we need to just mount the pinion gear on the motor. Very small 1.5mm grub screw. And just pop a little dab of blue Loctite on there. That's just going to hold it in place and stop it backing out when you're on the rocks. And then just put a couple of turns on. You'll see on the motor there's a flat spot, and that's where that grub screw is going to locate. At the moment we're just going to hold it in place because we don't know whereabouts, how far in or out we're going to want it when it's actually mounted. So to mount the motor, 2.5mm driver, a hex bit, and then a washer. And these then go through the motor plate and into the motor itself. And there's 2 of these in total. Again, just wind them on roughly. Same again with the second one. So 2 things we have to do now. 1, get the mesh between the gears and the motor correct. And then 2, we want to try and get the face of this pinion gear flush with that idle gear. So you can see now that the face of the pinion gear is flush with the idle gear. And then we've set it so that you can just rock the pinion gear on the idle gear. Shouldn't be tight, otherwise you put excessive wear on those bearings and they get hot and fail, and also put extra strain on the motor. See that now turns around. So finally we need to just seal in the pinion. There's a little plate and there's a groove. It just drops in that groove, and plate clips down, and then 2 screws, little dab of Loctite on them, and 2 more hex, and they just tighten down into the motor plate. Okay, now we're ready to open bag B and start putting this sub-assembly onto the axles.